Hello, welcome to the Camlog surgical tutorial. You know, it's easy to place an implant if you have enough bone. But if you don't have enough bone and you want to place implant and do bone augmentation same time, the most challenging part is not the augmentation itself. It's the covering of the augmentation. And I'd like to show you a technique which I call the poncho flap, with which you can cover even largest bone augmentation without tension, with a good nutrition for the bone, and with an easy closing procedure. Let's have a look at the flap design. That's the lower jaw, the bone. This is the cheek. This is the gingiva. Here we have keratinized gingiva. This is mucogingival junction, which means we have the insertion of the mimic muscle here. If we want to place an implant together with bone augmentation, we use a special flap design which starts in the deepest point of the vestibular area. So the first cut is here. We stay strictly above the mimic muscle to the insertion of the mimic muscle. Here we cut the periosteum. Let's draw the periosteum. This is periosteum. From here we cut down to the bone and we lift the periosteum together with the flap down to the lingual area. So once again, this is the first flap. Now let's raise the flap. This was the first cut here. We have a mucosal flap. That's the point where we came in. Now we went down to the bone. So the flap becomes thicker and it contains periosteum. Now we have a combined flap, mucosal flap and mucoperiosteal flap. The second flap is the muscular flap. So now we cut the muscle away from the periosteum. After cutting, the periosteum stays to the bone and we have a free muscle flap. Now the periosteum is lifted as a single flap. So we have three flaps. Flap number 1, flap number 2, the muscle flap, and a periosteal flap. Now we place the implant. Because of the bone is resorbed, the implant is not completely covered with bone. We might augment the bone by placing a membrane, and beyond the membrane, a bone substitute. That's the bone substitute, together with blood or with bone cells, or even bone chips. Now we have to close this again. And the closing also is done in layers. The first closure, we close the periosteum only by adapting it to the augmentation. We do this from the lingual side through the periosteum and back again. The second suturing again goes through the lingual side, through the muscle and back again. And now the muscle is pulled above the augmentation. Finally, we again might close with single sutures this part again here, although we enhance the thickness of the bone. Let's do it on the picture. On the picture you can easily see the ridge defect. This ridge has a thickness of roughly 3 to 4 millimeters. In the front it has more than double. So let's start with the first incision. It's done in the vestibular area. Don't cut too deep, because you are immediately on the fascia of the muscle. Vertical releasing incision. And also here a vertical releasing incision. Now we start to split in both directions. That's the split to the buccal. Only about 3 millimeters. It makes suturing much more easy later on. And now we go ahead in the lingual direction. We stay strictly above the mimic muscle. So as you see, this is a split thickness flap. No periosteum inside, no muscle inside. Now I'm directly in the area where the muscle inserts to the bone. This is the mucogingival junction. Now I touch the bone with a knife. The incision goes down to the bone. So from now we go ahead with a mucoperiosteal flap. For this I use the respiratory. Take your time by designing your flap. It mustn't be perforated in that part, because later we need this flap as coverage of the bone augmentation. So now we have a mucosal and mucoperiosteal flap. With a holding suture we suture it to the lingual sides. Now the flap is fixed on the lingual part. Here you still can see the mimic muscle. This is prepared with the scissors. You easily can deflect the muscle and can leave the periosteum to the bone. If you are close to any kind of anatomic structure you don't want to destroy, you use the scissors closed, push it into the tissue, and you now open with a dull scissor side. Especially in the area of the mental nerve, this technique is very easy. So now we have the muscle flap. Finally, we raise the periosteal flap. So this is the periosteum. The third flap. Because of the periosteum is very rigid, you can't pull it over the augmentation later on. So now we can see that there is a very sharp-edged bone. Here we place an implant. So we start with a round burr. We go ahead with a pilot drill. The 3.3 form drill. And the 3.8 form drill. The last drill is the 4.3. And now we have a buccal defect. If you now look at the outside of the bone, the buccal side, you see that there is a recession, bony recession defect. So if you now would only place the implant, there would be no bone on the buccal side. In the lower jaw, especially in the front or in the premolar region, we also use the dense bone drill because of hard bone. Prior to implant placement, I'd like to show you the buccal defect. Now we place the implant. The implant is in place, but you can see that on the buccal side there is not covered implant surface. We close the implant with a cover screw. And now we do the bone augmentation. Herefore, I use a membrane. I check the size of the membrane. It's slightly too big. Better. And now I place the membrane with titanium tacks. Both tacks in place. Now we have to augment the missing bone. For this we use a xenogen bone substitute. That's a xenograft together with some blood. The material is put close to the surface of the implant with low pressure. To produce a kind of a scaffold for the augmentation, we use the so-called sliced membrane technique. So we slice the membrane in the middle. Approximately to the level of the augmentation. And now we push first the one side beyond the lingual flap. And now the other side, slightly crossing. Now we have closed margins, mesial and distal, and we have a nice round augmentation above the implant. The final step is suturing in 3 layers. We start with a periosteal suture. For this we have to remove the holding stitches. On the lingual side we stitch first, then we go through the periosteum on the buccal side, and again through the lingual flap. With this suture, the augmentation is kept in place. Now you see this is the periosteal suture. You can't pull the periosteum more towards the crest because it's rigid. You can't pull it, but you can fix the augmentation on the buccal side. The next suture is the muscle suture. Again, we go through the flap on the lingual side. Now we go through the muscle and back to the lingual side. And now you see the miracle of this suturing technique. By placing the knot, you see that the muscle now is moving above the augmentation. The same suture on the distal side. And back again through the lingual flap. And now you see again how magically the muscle is pulled beyond the flap. This technique allows you to cover even largest augmentations without any tension. Look here. Now almost the entire augmentation is covered with muscle, and the final flap is tension-free and can be sutured with 6-0 or 5-0 suturing material. Without any tension. The final sutures with 6-0, just to adapt the margins of the flap. You see no tension. Take your time for suturing, because if the suture is done properly, you have the best nutrition for the augmentation, a nice soft tissue healing, and almost no scar tissue. You even did not lose any keratinized tissue, because you didn't touch the keratinized tissue. Two sutures to go, and then we do the vertical suturing. The vertical releasing incisions are then sutured also without any tension to the fixed gingiva left and right. So now, knotting the last. Finally, you see that even in large augmentations, there is a sufficient covering method. I'd like to summarize. This technique allows you not only to cover augmentations which are very big, you also can keep even a narrow band of keratinized gingiva. And the biggest advantage is you can use a muscle as best bleeding nutrition for your augmentation. So this is really one of my favorite flaps, and I hope you enjoyed this and have a lot of success by doing this by your own.